The reason you crash in your training session with your type 1 diabetes, so you get a hypo, you get this very shaky low, and then you get a rebound high afterwards, or you get a high before the training session and then your blood sugar drops, is that the standard carb advice that you get a lot of times from your endocrinologist for training with type 1 diabetes is one size fits all. And your body is not one size fits all. And it just isn't true a lot of times. So the standard carb advice that we get a lot of times with type 1 diabetes, and we tell our endocrinologist, our doctor, hey, I'm working out, how do I handle my blood sugar with it, is that you have to do 20 grams of glucose, 20 grams of carbs, like a banana or 200 milliliters of juice or something like that for 1 hour of working out. And maybe your standard one size fits all advice looked a bit different, or ideally maybe you got even more context around that. But in most cases, and most clients that work with me tell me these kind of things, that they get the standard advice of usually it's 20 grams of carbs for 1 hour of working out. And if you're active for a longer time than that, then you should just double the amount of carbs. Like for 2 hours, do 40 grams, and so on and so forth. And that standard advice, this generic advice, then leads to this mid-workout crash, the shaky low. And especially if you want to lose weight, you're constantly being forced to consume more calories, to eat more sugar, and then you get a high after because you overcorrected because you were scared, or maybe you had the high before the training session, you corrected, and then you dropped like crazy, got super shaky and sweaty in the training session and just didn't feel good, and then kind of traumatizes you every time you're working out. And this really doesn't have to be the case. And if you understand a bit more about what is going on in your body, then you can really prevent a lot of these situations from coming up. And particularly in these situations when women 40 plus come to me, tell me, hey, I want to lose weight, but I really can't because I'm constantly forced to have these extra calories. That makes me sad, because you put in so much effort, and then seeing all of this effort being diminished, so to say, and you being kicked in the gut, so to say, from your type 1 diabetes, when all your effort of eating carefully, working out a lot, not getting the desired result is really a pity, and not a nice situation to be in. And as I said, you can work around that, and that's what we're talking about today. The main issue is that our bodies are more complex than that. There's different systems in the body, and not all kinds of training need 20 grams of carbs for an hour. This is just super generic and specific advice, and the reason that it doesn't work is that the same 45 minutes can send you low for some types of workouts, or hold you flat, like keep the blood sugar stable in some other types of workouts, or even increase your blood sugar in some other scenarios. Okay, so a fixed number obviously can't do that job, right? And you've probably witnessed it. You kind of, maybe you're doing that at home, cleaning something, cleaning the place, or just taking a walk, and suddenly your blood sugar drops, and then some other activities that are way more strenuous and way more exhausting suddenly don't have your blood sugar drop. So it's weird. It can go in either way. So what I would like you to do, first of all, is understand the different engines that our bodies use to create energy. Because if you do that, then you will be able to gauge yourself in the future. Do I need carbs? Don't I need carbs maybe? What do I need to do, right? How do I need to balance it out? And the understanding for now is more important than you getting fixed rules, because then with that nuance and context, you will be able to make way better decisions. So let's start talking about these 3 engines that our bodies use. And this is basic exercise physiology, can be looked up if you're curious about it as well. And I'm kind of trying to keep it in simple, pragmatic terms. Okay, so the first engine we call, for now, for today's purposes, the sprint engine. If you want to nerd out about it, this is called the anaerobic alactic, mode of creating energy, so to say. Now, this always plays a role in the first 10 seconds of activity. So when you're doing something like sprints, 50-meter sprints, and then you're resting again, or you're doing something like 3 jumps as high as possible. So you're doing very short bursts of energy. That can be sprints, that can be jumps, that can be also, we're getting to that when I talk about more specific examples later. So later I'll walk you through what kind of sports will require what kind of engines. That will be the case when you're doing weightlifting, with just 1, 2, 3 repetitions, so high weights, but with very low repetitions. And then this, what we call sprint engine, comes into play. And you can think of it as running on fuel, or it's being based on fuel that is already stored in the muscle, okay? So there is no sugar that needs to be pulled out of your blood, and that's why your blood sugar doesn't go down, because it's the energy is being created with a fuel that is stored inside of your muscle cells. That's how you can think of it, okay? So again, it's a jump, it's a heavy lift, it's a short sprint, and these kind of things. And a lot of times, right, talking about that in a second as well, in a lot of different sports disciplines, you're actually not constantly active. A lot of times, even for example, soccer players, if you look at what they're doing, a lot of times they are standing and waiting, and then they have these short sprints. And that's when this can get relevant, for example, right? If you don't have this continuous motion like a marathon runner, but you have these short explosions and then you're resting again, short explosions and then you're resting again, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when you're not feeling this burn, when there's no sugar burn, that's kind of this sprint engine. Okay, and what happens here is that your blood sugar barely moves. And a lot of times it even goes up, because these high intensities also lead to your body excreting these stress hormones like adrenaline, right? Then also cortisol over time. And that sometimes makes your blood sugar even go up, right? Because it's the opposite. There's no sugar pulled out of your blood, but if anything, the physiological stress in your body actually increases the sugar in your blood, okay? And what I would also want you to understand before we go on to the next engine is that there is no black and white. There's no switch from engine 1 to 2 to 3. It's always an overlap and always a spectrum that we're on. Okay, so it's like a three-dimensional spectrum. That's how you can think of it. And it's not like one is on, then the other is off, and so on and so forth. So a lot of times we can be in this engine, but then we're also kind of in the second engine, which we're talking about now. So the blood sugar kind of is steady or even drops a bit. So just for context, it's not always like that. And every time we're using models like these are always by definition false, right? Because we're trying to simplify something that is way more complex in the real world. Now, the second engine I want to talk about, and because it's the most easy way to understand and most descriptive, you can think of it like the burn engine, because a lot of times you feel this muscle burn, for example, when you have this engine active when you're strength training. And on the when we're doing the nerd talk, it's the anaerobic lactic way of your body producing the energy. Okay, so if you want to look it up, it's glycolytic or anaerobic lactic. Now, this takes place when your effort is 10 seconds to 2 minutes. So you're active, or you're doing something actively for 10 seconds to 2 minutes, right? And then you're stopping again. So you can think of it like burning sugar. So your body burns now through sugar, and your muscles use the sugar storages which the muscles have, right? So it uses the glycogen storages, we call them, and it even starts pulling sugar out of your blood. So you already know, okay, it can reduce actually your blood sugar. And it does that without using oxygen, right? And the oxygen gets relevant in the third engine, which we're talking about in a second. And that second engine, it makes lactate, okay, over time. And that is the burn, right? That is why I call it burn engine. And a lot of times when you were in the fitness studio or something like that, or you were climbing stairs, maybe you had like a flight of stairs, where you were climbing stairs for a long time, maybe you can remember something like that, and your legs start to burn, or you did something for a bit of a longer time. That's what we call this burn engine, and that is this lactic acid buildup that leads to that burn. And to simplify that, we're calling it burn engine for now. Okay, so it's like you go to the fitness studio and you do repetitions like 8 to 12, 8 to 14, something like that. And that's when you feel this burn, okay? So it can be short rests and harder intervals, something like that. And it can even lead to your blood sugar going up in the moment and then later dropping, because again, right, like in the first engine, a lot of times with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, your blood sugar goes up. But since you used up a lot of these glycogen storages, the glucose and the carbs and the glycogen storages in your muscle, these will be refilled later. That's what we call the refill effect. And then suddenly your body pulls sugar out of your blood in the glycogen storages, and that's when the blood sugar drops again, okay? So sports that are using that kind of engine would be rowing, for example. Like when you're rowing, maybe you've done that. There's also the rowing machines in the gym, but you're also rowing on water. That's this burn engine. Okay, so that's how you can think of it. That's what you can think of to like understand it in real life. Okay, it's these intervals that take a bit of a longer time, or it's also something something like 400-meter running. Okay, it's also it's the worst type of sprints. Okay, if you've done that once, 400-meter sprints, that's like the worst kind of sprints, the most painful kind of sprints, and these will take like probably longer than 2 minutes for most people, but right, that's also like what recruits this burn engine. Right, so blood sugar can go up in the moment. Sometimes if you're doing that type of workout also for a longer time, it can also then even drop because your body already needs to refill those glycogen storages. But the dip can come later, as I said. Okay, what I also want to emphasize here is that because of the reason that these engines are not always like switched on and switched off, but it's like a spectrum that you're always on, a lot of times if you just do these short sprints from engine one, right, like these short bursts of energy, but you have very low rest periods in between, like you have just 10-second intervals of being active, of doing something, but you have very short rest periods as well, like just 20 seconds, 30 seconds, then this will still at some point recruit this burn engine. So it doesn't just depend on how long you're doing something, but also what's the rest period in between, right? What's the time that you give your body to pause, to recover. And then the last but also important engine that we need to cover so that you get a good understanding of it, we could call the endurance engine. And as you can already imagine, it's for longer times, right? When you're active for longer times, like continuously active for longer times, like more than 2 minutes in that scenario. Or then also not just when you're active more than 2 minutes, but also if the rest period between certain intervals of you being active is very short. So for example, you have like a 30-second, you're doing something for 30 seconds, like you're doing a YouTube workout and you're doing burpees and jumping jacks. But then after these 30 seconds, you're just resting for 20 seconds or even just for 30 seconds. And then you're repeating it again. Then again, you're in the endurance engine because you haven't allowed proper rest in between. So by short rest periods, you can also get in this endurance engine. And the way our body creates energy here is the aerobic way. So our bodies use oxygen to create the energy. So that's also why it's called aerobic, right? Or the oxidative way to create the energy for our bodies. Okay, so it's using literally oxygen to create the energy, and that engine, depending on how intense, because there's also within that engine obviously differences, uses fats and glucose and sugar to create energy. If you're doing something in a very low intensity for a very long time, your body will default to using fats. And if you're doing something in that aerobic engine, right, in this endurance engine, but with a bit of a higher intensity, then it will rather default to using glucose. So you can think of glucose and sugar as a faster resource to create that energy for your body. Okay, some examples would be if you do like steady walking or like easy cycling, or you're doing like some form of dance, like partner's dance, for a bit of a longer time. So your blood sugar just goes down over time, right? Not super fast usually, depending on how intense it is, but your blood sugar goes down and it keeps pulling for hours, right? Depending on how long you're doing that, okay? So again, for very low intensity, if it's like super slow, like you're not even walking, you're maybe on, I don't know, the treadmill at like a super slow pace, or you're sitting on a spinning bike and you're just moving your legs in slow motion, then obviously your body won't use up much carbs to create the energy. Then it's more that your body is using fats to create that same energy, okay? So again, after all, when you move, your muscles pull sugar out of your blood without needing insulin. That's like an extra mechanism. So this is this one mechanism that even for us with type 1 diabetes, our bodies don't need insulin, right, to have the sugar being pulled out of blood, which is an advantage. And this happens up to about 5 times more. okay? So movement lowers your sugar and lets you use less insulin after all. And less insulin means less fat storage. And that's right, to make it simple, that's why it's so interesting and beneficial for us to be active and find ways for our bodies to need less insulin in the long run as well. Now, we want to match this to the actual workouts that you're doing, okay? Because right now this is a lot of theory and I want you to get this understanding, but also you should have practical examples, and I'm walking you through these practical examples right now. And before I walk you through all of these disciplines and different types of sports that you might be doing, also understand that a lot of times your training will look different like a typical match in the same thing. So for example, like a soccer player will likely use different ways of creating energy, like physiologically, in a soccer match, right? When they're actually having a match as opposed to the training session, because they're doing something different. So just also understand that, but I'll give some examples in a second. So let's say, first of all, couples dancing or ballroom dancing, okay? So most likely this will be steady endurance type of training, obviously, right? If you're going to a ballroom class and your trainer is also like a Zumba instructor and wants you to do like aerobic warm-ups where you run around and do I don't know what kind of stuff, then obviously there will be different systems at play. But just for the ballroom dancing, this is mostly this endurance engine, type 3 engine that we talked about, where your sugar drifts down over a long night, okay? So it won't rapidly go down depending on how much insulin on board there is, which also, by the way, is something we talk about in a second, but your blood sugar will drift down over the course of the time. Then second example would be golf, okay? So you're walking the course for hours, and you have this slow and steady drop as well, because again, it's the aerobic way or the endurance engine that our bodies need in that case. If you look at the swing, right, the golf swing, then you could think of that obviously because it's a higher intensity as a tiny sprint engine, but this barely counts because obviously it's just like a fraction, it's just a second that you're doing it, right? So it doesn't really count. And also your body is not doing something as intense as like a jump, a sprint or something like that, because it's just one swing, just to make the example complete. And then with the golf example, depending on how the field the field looks that you're using there, when you go uphill, obviously, this is then a more intense type of this endurance engine. So this could use up more glucose than when you're just walking on a steady surface, right? When you're walking downhill or on a steady surface. So it is kind of a different situation, okay? Now in a second, also walk you through how we go about these different, depending on what kind of engine that is, how do we adjust our insulin or eat glucose and so on and so forth. But for now, let's stick with some more examples. Tennis, if you look at the match, right, the tennis match, then this would be more of a stop-start kind of game, because a lot of times you also stand around. If you look at the full tennis match can last hours, then you're standing around for a long time, and then you have these short bursts, right? Depending on how good you are at tennis, obviously. If you're not that good, then you will have 1 or 2 exchanges and then it will stop again because someone will put the ball, I don't know, somewhere else. But if, of course, right, you're a skilled tennis player, then one of those exchanges can last like up to a minute, because everyone is always hitting the ball, right? And it doesn't stop right away. Again, the beginner, of course, will just be an exchange of 2-3 hits with the tennis ball, to give that example as well. But in itself, the tennis match will be short bursts, okay? So a lot of times it can be that, so there will, first of all, it's mixed, right? Because also if you're walking around, again, then you're in the endurance engine. Then if you have a more exchanges with the tennis ball from one side to the next, then it can be the burn engine as well, because you're running a lot. And it can be like an interval of up to a minute where you're constantly running very fast and at a high intensity. But a lot of times it's also just, right, you're hitting the ball once and the other player doesn't hit the ball, and then it was just the sprint engine. So for tennis, it's mixed, right? And depending on how intense it is, might be that you need to like eat a lot of sugar, carbs in between, or might be that your blood sugar, if it's just the sprint engine, might actually go up over time, okay? So it can be very mixed for something like tennis and also other kind of, let's say, other kind of sports where you have like an opponent or you have a ball and an opponent in the game. So, right, these kind of team sports as well. Another example would be volleyball. Let's take this as an example. You have these short jumps and spikes with rest in between, right? So again, it's the sprint engine primarily because you have your team as well. You don't need to run like for a long time with volleyball. It's usually like jumps and then short bursts, but you also have like some rest periods in between. So I would say primarily with volleyball, it's the sprint engine, but it can also turn a bit into the burn engine, but primarily the sprint engine. So the blood sugar should stay fairly flat for volleyball. And in some cases, of course, with high insulin on board, it can also drop. But in some cases, it might even rise when you play volleyball, okay? Because of the mechanism that I explained with the sprint engine in the beginning. Now also understand that the training of a volleyball player, a tennis player, or golf could look entirely different. So if you're doing conditioning for that same kind of sports where you're running around, you're doing a lot of jumps and sprints, then you might be in a completely different engine suddenly, in the endurance engine or the burn engine, because you're doing a conditioning for that kind of sports. Now it's a different conversation if that conditioning actually makes sense, if it's separate from what you're actually doing during a match, but just understand that as well. It can be a completely different thing in a match compared to a training session, okay? The next thing, and the next example, because I know a lot of women with type 1 diabetes also like to do that, is Pilates classes, okay? So doing these slow and controlled motions, there's a very little change, and it's not like these super high intensities, but also it can burn a lot. So this is a mixture of the burn engine and the endurance engine. Since the rest periods in between those different exercises and sets during a Pilates session is very low, it tends to be more of the endurance engine actually, okay? So it's a mix of this burn engine and endurance engine. So there will definitely be a blood sugar drop in most cases, and depending on how advanced you are and how difficult the exercises are that you're doing there, you might need a lot of sugar in such a session even to take care of that, depending on also the insulin on board, of course, okay? So this can be something quite intense. Then the Zumba session is very similar, okay? So it's like this continuous motion as well. So you're in the endurance engine primarily in the Zumba session, okay? You will feel less of this burn that you will have in Pilates, but it will be a continuous motion with very little rest in between. So it's the endurance engine, and it will also tend to go down when you're doing a session over time. Okay, but the tendency will be that it will go down less fast than with a Pilates class, for example, or with a body pump class. For example, the body pump class will behave more similarly to the Pilates class, for example. And then, last but not least, because it's something that I encourage a lot, the strength training. The strength training is really important to understand. It strongly depends on how you lift, because if we look at the engines that we talked about, more than 2 minutes is the endurance engine. So even for strength training, if you're doing more than 15 repetitions and you're doing them in a slow and controlled fashion, it can be that you're in the endurance engine. But if you're doing something like 10 to 15 repetitions, or even 9 to 15, you're probably in the burn engine. And if you're doing something like 3 to 6 repetitions, or even 1 to 4, 1 to 5 repetitions, you're very likely in the sprint engine. So in the sprint engine, very likely, your blood sugar will stay flat or even go up. In the burn engine, like 10 to 15 repetitions, the medium repetitions, or 8 to 15 repetitions, your blood sugar will likely stay. If you're doing it for a longer time, even drop, or in some cases, if there's a lot of adrenaline, if the weights are very demanding for you, and if it's also stress to the body to an extent, then your blood sugar might go up and then drop afterwards, depending on also how many sets you're doing in that training and how intense it is for you. And when you're doing more the strength endurance type of workouts, like 14, 15, or even more repetitions, like a lot of repetitions, then you will be in the endurance engine. So there will be this steady trend down with your blood sugar. Okay. So just to understand, the sport itself doesn't even decide the sugar. So strength is not strength, volleyball is not volleyball, but the engine and how you're feeling. Okay. What it is like to do that training session. Not necessarily how you're feeling, of course, but I'm trying to simplify it by also showing you the sensation, okay? So sprint versus the burn sensation versus the endurance of the steady repetitive motion engine, okay? So really try to understand the concept behind it. And I'll give you some simple rules of thumb to understand that, so that you can also then gauge to like how you will respond with your blood sugar, the glucose that you're eating, and the insulin, okay? So simple example. The talk test. If you can hold a conversation and it lasts many minutes during the activity, example golf, example walking, example these kind of things, you're in the endurance engine. So expect a drop. Reduce your basal insulin rate if you can do that with your pump, for example, or alternatively, make sure that you set the blood sugar target with your pump higher. So instead of a blood sugar target of, let's say, of 5.3 or 6 if you're using millimole, or a blood sugar target of 80 or 100 or 110 if you're using milligrams per deciliter. Set up 150, 180 as the blood sugar target, so that your pump doesn't inject too much insulin, so that then you're dropping, because you're doing that kind of activity that, right, would fall under the talk test, like the golf, walking, a hike in the weekend or something like that, okay? So switch up the basal rate, the pump blood sugar target. And if you don't have that option to do so because you're using pens and you injected the basal insulin in the morning or the night before, then of course you need more snacks, or you bring some juice, you bring some fruit to that activity, so that you can then correct the blood sugar, of course, right? Or if you're doing the basal insulin in the morning and you know you will do a hike for the whole day, then of course do a bit less basal insulin, so that your blood sugar will not drop that much, all right? So that's what you can think of, and how you can go through the endurance engine that fits this kind of talk test. The talk test doesn't always work, because also with Pilates or Zumba, a lot of times you're in the endurance engine, but you're not really able to talk, okay? So of course there will be exceptions to that rule, but also with Pilates and Zumba, primarily like Pilates, body pump, these kind of things where you have these longer periods and stuff, and your body uses a lot of glucose, and you're still in the endurance engine, of course, but it's a bit of a higher intensity, right? So you will need to correct that temporary blood sugar target in your pump, or reduce the basal insulin rate even more with these kind of activities, because it still falls in the endurance engine. So that's what you can think of. The burn test is obviously, right, this burning sensation. You probably have felt it before if you're walking a lot of stairs, or if you're doing strength training with like these 8, 10, 12, 14 repetitions. That's when you're breathing hard, your muscles are burning, or you're running for a longer time, like you're running for 200 meters, 400 meter sprints, if you can think of that back in school, or maybe you're even still doing it, 200 meter sprints, 400 meter sprints, something like that, or even 1000 meter sprints at times. That's when you're in the burn engine, and that's when it gets a lot of times really nasty, right? Because it's not a nice feeling, and you can expect a rise at times in the moment, okay? But a drop later, because your body has used up a lot of these glycogen storages and the glucose stored, right? And therefore, these glycogen storages will be refilled, and then you might, if you have dinner afterwards, you might need less insulin, because that glycogen storage is being refilled, and you need sometimes 2, 4, depending on also how advanced you are with your training. I really can't tell you as a generic rule of thumb, because it depends. You will need way less insulin. If someone has a lot of muscle, right, for example, and is very experienced as a sprinter, their bodies are so efficient at using these glycogen storages that they would then, if they were type 1 diabetics as well, would maybe need 10 units less of insulin, because there's so much of that glycogen that needs to be refilled, you see? So it depends on the situation. It's just that I want you to understand the concept, as I said before. A lot of times when that burn engine though lasts for a longer time, because you're, for example, doing a Pilates session, and then you have these 1-2 minutes intervals that you're doing, and then you rest just real quick, and then you have these again, then you have them again, then you have them again, then of course at some point your blood sugar will still drop, even though you're in the burn engine, okay? So that's also something to consider, that even though it's a stressor and adrenaline and cortisol are being excreted, and your blood sugar can rise. At some point it can still drop, even though you're in the burn engine, okay? Just for context. And then the explosive test is the next one. So if you're doing very explosive things, like you have these short, powerful bursts of energy, and then you're resting for a long time, like you have a sprinter would be working out. You do 10-second sprint and then you're resting for a longer time. Or you're doing like 3 jumps as far as possible and then you're resting for a longer time. Or you're doing something like volleyball, like a volleyball match where you're just jumping as high as possible. Or you're doing a short explosive burst to reach the ball or something like that, reach the volleyball, and then you're resting again, right? Because that's how a volleyball like a match looks like a lot of times. That's when you can be in this first engine, in the sprint engine, and a lot of times there is no real change with the blood sugar, but some other times blood sugar can even go up a bit, okay? So because there's no sugar being used to create the energy. That's what we discussed earlier, okay? So that's what I want you to think of. As you see, there's no rules of thumb, and it will still require you to test and see how this works, but it gives you an understanding, and now you will understand, okay, that's why my body reacts X, Y, Z kind of way, and that's where I want you to be. This is where the work starts, right? Maybe you're disappointed I didn't give you the magic formula to manage your blood sugar perfectly, but this is where it starts, and this is also the way I teach it my clients, right? I of course give them more specific because I then know their context. When I work with my clients and help them stabilize blood sugar in their strength training, in their classes of whatever they're doing, whatever sports they're doing, I know their context, their weight, their muscle mass, their age, how active they are throughout the day, how much insulin they need, and then I can give them more specific examples. For you, that's obviously not possible right now, but that's what you need to understand to even get a grasp of how this all works, because otherwise you're just going to use the random rules and your blood sugar will go up, will go down, and then you're just shaking your training session and you don't want to work out at all anymore, and you lose your motivation to work out, which is not the idea, right? That's not where we want to go. Workout should be something positive, something that you're looking forward to in the long run, okay? Now, the big thing that changed some of these things is the insulin on board. A lot of times when we had our food before, when we like have our meals before we have lunch and then we go work out, our blood sugar can drop even though we're in the sprint engine. If we're just on the way to our workout session, like I'm walking 10 minutes to my gym and I have a lot of insulin on board, then my blood sugar will drop, not because of my strength training when it's very heavy, for example, but because of my walk to the gym. Right? So the insulin on board changes a lot, especially if you're active after that insulin on board, okay? So that's something to understand. And ideally, you don't want to work out with like very high insulin on board. Also, most people don't like to work out when they're feeling very heavy and they haven't digested their food yet. So 1 to 2 hours after a meal with your bolus still working, right? Because most insulins do stay, like are active in our bodies like 3-4-ish hours, there's a higher risk for your blood sugar dipping, right? And that also has to do with how active you are before your training session. If you're sitting around all day and you had your meal and for the first time you're standing up, for the first time of the day you're actually getting up to go to your training session, then suddenly there will be a lot of insulin acting, because insulin tends to not act that well if you're not moving around and if you're just sitting, right? And then a lot of these insulin clumps in your body will suddenly start to move around and then start working. That's maybe something that you've even experienced before. And then you have this higher dip risk, even like on top of the high insulin on board, if you've not been active before. Just something to consider as well, okay? So that's why generally, like if you have to eat before a training session, like have an actual meal before the training session, I would recommend you to do moderate carbs, if anything. And actually also, and that's what I will walk you through in a second, how we time that with the bolus. Actually make sure that you're not bolusing like huge amounts and that you're doing like a pre-bolus. So with the pre-bolus, like bolusing 10, 15, 20, depending on the food, minutes before your meal, it will catch this initial spike, so your blood sugar stays flat, and then you also haven't injected that much overall, so that when you're then active, it doesn't drop that much, okay? But I'll talk about that in a second as well. Yeah. Now, if we had to sum up these first 3 topics that we talked about, don't ask yourself how long you are training, but ask yourself which kind of engine it is that you're using, right? The sprint, the burn, or the endurance engine? That's the better question to ask. And how much insulin, that's the same thing we just talked about, is still acting in your body, because that obviously will change a lot of the other things as well, right? How high is your basal rate when you now start walking? Because the basal insulin is also there. When was the last time you've eaten? Is there still insulin in your body that is still active from your meal, right? So that's a differentiator. Now, how do we actually go about it? In some directions, I already gave you a lot of stuff that you can work with, of course, but here's some more specific advice for depending on the engine that you're using. Okay, so with pens, pumps, like depending on what you're using, and also then the type of insulin, the sensitivity will always differ. Okay, so I'll give you the directions. The directions, just like before, I'll not give you any specific generic tips. Like I'll not give you any like specific numbers, generic numbers. I'll give you directions like I did before, plus my own example. So for example, for a steady endurance engine, okay, like a longer walk, like longer cardio, a Zumba class, or even like a Pilates class, something like that, I would lower the background insulin, the basal insulin, ahead of time, as in adjusting the basal rate or setting the glucose target, the blood sugar level target higher, so that your body gives you less, as your pump gives you less insulin. Okay, and also I will do a way smaller meal bolus for myself. For example, if I work out, I do 50% of the insulin only for the same amount of carbs. Okay, 50% less. If I also know that I'll be walking for a certain amount of time to my training session, so I'm active on the way of going there, I will just do 25% of the bolus insulin. Okay, so let's say I have 80 grams of carbs, like a little oatmeal before my training session. I know I will walk there, either go there by bike or walk there or go there by public transport. I will just do 25%. So instead of my regular 8 units of insulin for 80 grams of carbs, I will just do 2 units. Okay, so that's my example. That's what I found works for me. And that's what you need to find out for yourself. Okay, so reduce the bolus before with the carbs, and definitely also reduce the basal for the endurance engine. Yeah, okay, so that's the last engine of these. If I do intervals or hard lifting or something like that, like strength training, like intervals with high intensity, these bursts of energy and something like that, I eat little to no carbs. Okay, because with the sprint engine, your body doesn't even need carbs to create the energy there. Okay, in that specific example, sometimes I need a bit more insulin after that, because again, with the adrenaline and cortisol that is increasing with that kind of training session, your blood sugar is increasing, and then you need a bit more insulin to get it back down, because it's a stress reaction in the end of the day. Okay, which is nothing bad, but I actually need less carbs than before. So that's what you can think of, okay? Because this engine pushed me up. And with the burn engine specifically, if we're doing strength training, and by the way, with the sprint engine that I just talked about, with the high intensity intervals or heavyweight strength training, a lot of times I don't even change my basal rate. So I keep my basal rate the same, it keeps me steady, and then afterwards, I sometimes even need more insulin because my blood sugar went up because of the stress reaction in the body. Then if it's the burn engine, a lot of times it will be the same thing as in the stress reaction throughout the training session. It doesn't change my insulin need throughout the training, so my basal insulin will stay the same, you see? So I don't change my basal insulin rate. And with pens, you do the same thing in the morning that you would also usually do. But after the training session, or during the training session, your blood sugar again go up, but it will then go down because of the glycogen storages, the sugar storages in your muscles essentially, that are being refilled. So the body is taking sugar out of your blood to refill those storages. And in that case, of course, you would need to be very cautious with your bolus, because depending on how experienced you are and how heavy your training was, you will sometimes need 1 unit less of insulin, 2 units less, or 8 units less of insulin, because your body refills those glycogen storages. So in other words, you would need an extra apple, an extra banana, or even an extra pizza, right, in terms of the amount of carbs to refill those glycogen storages. So it then depends on your training experience, but that's the case for the burn engine, okay? So now you have an idea of how this works. For something like the burn engine that is kind of mixed with the endurance engine, so let's take the example of body pump or Pilates class. A lot of times you will actually need to do it very similarly to what did I say? Yeah, mixed burn engine and endurance engine. A lot of times you will need to reduce the basal rate or set the blood sugar target higher so that your pump is using less insulin, okay? So that it doesn't drop during the session because you're in the endurance engine. And on top of that, after the training session, because you were also in the burn engine, you will need more carbs / less insulin for the same amount of carbs, because your body is refilling those sugar storages again, okay? So also take into consideration, like for example, the body pump or Pilates class, that sometimes engines can be mixed, like the endurance and the pump engine, the burn engine, right? So that's the idea. But again, please, the examples that I gave you, this is just my examples in my body and what I learned in the last 14 years managing my own type 1 diabetes. For you, that very likely will be very different, okay? Because we're all individual. So make sure that you're not just copying this one-to-one. Start conservative, always start with like the safe bet. Rather take into account your sugar going high than it going dangerously low. So be sure and always bring your juice that is fast acting, glucose tabs, or some emergency, right, stuff for like a very, very strong hypo. So stay cautious, stay safe. And like always adjust it one step at a time, because that will be safer than doing big jumps and big switches with insulin and carb timing and stuff like that, okay? So my clients with type 1 diabetes usually in week 1 start getting their blood sugar stable in their training sessions with that kind of advice, because I'm making it specific to their situation. Also, when we're implementing their meals and switching them up based on what they actually need, one step at a time, they will then usually experience, right, steady blood sugar, getting their blood sugar 80 or 90% in range, and really just also feeling way better and way safer with their training. And that's what we're doing by making it, adapting it to the actual engines depending on what kind of training they're actually doing, because of course I'll listen and see what they're doing and then give them specific tips, okay? The result is then that they're stronger in the training session. They can usually eat way more food, more carbs, while still making more progress, as in fat loss and getting stronger. They recover better, feel better, and just overall, depending on what goal they have, make faster progress. Okay, so that is what happens when you work with your body instead of just doing generic things like 1 hour of workouts, do 20 grams of carbs, which I hope after this whole explanation and whole context I just gave you sounds pretty hilarious to you, right? So it doesn't work this way. So, right, there's a reason our bodies are complex and there's different systems at play. After all, the daily blood sugar roller coaster that just gets worked with exercise really doesn't have to be there. Exercise is there to make you more healthy, right? To make you feel better mentally, to make you feel confident because you're losing the body fat, losing the belly fat, and just, right, living a longer, better life. And then with these generic tips, that's really something that annoys me so much, because I get told these kind of stories every single day. They do the opposite of that, and we really need to do a better job in diabetes healthcare, and people need to be educated better. So I hope this helped. I hope you got some good inspiration and context here. If you're curious, right, if our process with the metabolism reset system can work for you specifically, and if I can work and how this would look, if I can help and how this would look like, you can always send me a message via Instagram with the word reset, and I can check out if I can help, if this would work, if you're a good fit for that metabolism reset system. And otherwise, right, remember to scroll up, subscribe to the podcast, and rate the podcast. Looking forward to the next episode. Hope you enjoyed it.